All right, good evening, good vok, and so forth. Can you believe Hanukkah was only a week ago? It's unbelievable. Um, I want to start, as always, by thanking Shomer Muda for being the venue over here. I want to thank the Lehman family of Philadelphia here for sponsoring this series. Thank you to them. Tonight's sponsor, I want to thank you. As you can see, the gardens, the kids. So, who's little Safta? That's what I thought, yeah. She's over here, right? And Morty and one of his parents. And of course, I always want to thank the tech team over here, as we always do. I'm not used to all this efficiency, so you should all be appreciative. You don't have to sit down and wait 15 minutes while they get everything together. It's already in time. And let me just say, next week, no speech, correct? You look at the chart, and what you should do is don't keep the old where, when, and when. Get the new one. I don't know what's wrong with people. You know, I said you know me by now. We have to update from time to time because change happens. You understand? Things happen. So as things stand right now, I'm going to be out of town next week in the 5 towns. So it's in 2 weeks. Okay, not this coming Saturday, but in 2 weeks. And tell your friends unless you don't like them and you want them to come for nothing. Okay? Without any further ado, we'll get down to tonight's business. We're doing the series called the 2021 to 2022 winter series called The Last Years Before Oslo, the State of Israel and the Jewish People 1988 to 1992. Today's the 7th of the lectures, and it's entitled Bad Chemistry, the Bush Administration and State of Israel, Part 1. And without any further ado, I'll get down to the body of my remarks. Now, so we're talking about the Bush years. During the 8 years of the Ronald Reagan administration, Israel enjoyed what I would call a milder form of Donald Trump, even though he shoots his mouth off. But the Reagan administration, I would say, and the Trump administration, each in their own different way, had a very special relationship with Israel, who they considered the good guy. Okay? That doesn't mean that there were no bumps along the road, because it's going to be bumps along the road. I've never heard of a marriage that didn't have bumps along the road. Do you agree with what I'm saying or not? Now, unlike Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan did not say that settlements were illegal. People forget this, but I remember it. He didn't say there were violations of international law. When Carter was the president, it was a main point of American diplomacy, and State Department said all the time that the settlements are illegal. That means they're a violation of international law. I remember very clearly when Reagan came in, State Department said, yes, they're not illegal in terms of international law, but they don't help the peace process, which is a different kind of language. You understand? Which is a different kind of language. And that was a big difference between the Carter and Reagan administrations. And even the State Department, the 2 secretaries of state, which were Haig and the other guy, George Shultz, were, I would say, among the 2 or 3 most pro-Israel secretaries of state, which is quite a statement I just made. Okay? Now, it's not like Trump, right? For all of his screaming and cursing of Bibi, all the rest of it, when Israel had it great under him. That's one thing you can't deny. But, I mean, he recognized the Golan and all. It's ridiculous. But then, of course, Ronald Reagan left after 8 years. His popularity was strong enough to drag Bush in by the coattails. Right? I mean, look at this. This is all Bush. First election. Second time he lost. First election, when he beat Dukakis. That's a lot. Okay? That's a lot. May I point out Pennsylvania? I can't believe it says Maryland voted. I just can't believe that. But it must be a mistake on the coloring book. But the right, whatever the case, right? I'm saying it's not that long ago, but look how the political map of America has changed. That's my point. Okay. Now, but Bush got in because of Reagan's coattails. Let's put it that way. He didn't get it because everybody was in love with him. I mean, who was passionate about voting for George Bush Sr.? He wasn't that kind of a politician that evoked that kind of feelings among the people. Okay? Now, Bush is very interesting, as every president is. You don't get to be president without being interesting in some way or another. He really kind of lucked out because Bush wanted a career in politics, but he won once in Congress, I think. Then he lost running for Senate. He lost running for governor. He lost everything he went after, but he got appointed to big positions by President Nixon. Made him the ambassador to the UN. and then Ford made him the head of the CIA and the ambassador to China. I mean, these are important posts. He's had a Republican Party, things like that. But he lucked out that, Reagan beat him in the primaries, and then Reagan offered him the vice president. And because he was there for 8 years, he was in a place to become president. So he didn't work his way up in the regular way. That's a certain mahalach, you understand? You keep close to the coattails of a popular person. It's an unusual system, and he really came from, an Eisenhower type act. His father was a senator, okay? Bush's father was a senator back in Eisenhower time. So that's the kind of Republican Party came from, which was not the Republican Party from Reagan's time onwards down till today. That's not where the Republican Party is. Moreover, it's kind of interesting. I was just thinking in my mind, I can only think in the 20th century when we've had 3 patrician presidents. It's the 2 Roosevelts and Bush. These guys came from old money. They went to Ivy League. They went to the prep schools. That mahalach, right, is a very interesting one. Most presidents don't go that way, which is interesting. You understand? Most presidents don't come from the old families with estates here and there and the other and all over the place. Now, the Roosevelts did. Okay. They were from that echelon. And Bush was from that echelon. Okay?
Kennedy.
Will you let me finish? All right. They didn't come from here. Let's look at the next slide. Kennedy's father was a bootlegger. He didn't come from old money. He sent his kids with the illegal money that he made to the prep school because he gave him a varnish of a patrician. Kennedy was not he wouldn't know. He aspired to that. That's the story of Old Man Kennedy, right? That's the story of Old Man Kennedy. He aspired to that. And he did it, as we all know, through all this illegal junk. And he made his bucks. He was very smart at making money. And then he said like this, I will buy patrician status, which is good enough to fool you, by sending my kids to prep school and Harvard and all the rest of it. But let me put it this way: you can think what you want. Compare and contrast the private life of George Bush with John F. Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Bush was married to the same woman for 100 years. You see? I'll say no more. Now, Bush was a strange bird for Reagan in the post-Reagan era. He wasn't the right kind of Republican, I would say. And this played itself out when he lost the second time. Because he was an Eisenhower Republican. That's what his father was. There's Bush when he was a young man with Eisenhower. I think many of us are old enough to remember the Eisenhower Republicans, which is a dinosaur, correct? In other words, it was very moderate. There wasn't really much difference, say, for example, in policy between Nelson Rockefeller and John F. Kennedy. Can you think of a difference? It's the same thing, right? What was the big difference between Eisenhower and Truman in terms of their policy? It's the same thing. Yeah? A little. But now, by the way, that was the America of our youth, when politics was not as polarized, when the area of commonality was much larger than the area of difference, and therefore the media had to play up the small differences, okay? Because the small differences really belied the fact that actually a lot is in common, which I think is a good thing. But nowadays it's very different. There is a huge difference, for example, between Donald Trump and Biden. Okay? No, there just is, and there's a big difference between, DeSantis and Kamala, there just is. No, I'm saying it's not a little bit that they really agree in everything and we're just playing up like they're big principal differences. There's a chasm. Now, whether that's good or bad, it just reflects the body politic. But I'm talking about Bush is coming up in that region, in that era, but he came out of a different environment, okay? Because he's born with a silver spoon in the mouth. And, he had that upbringing. And therefore, the republicanism of that type was associated with the idea that, you keep even keel. They weren't really opposed to most of the liberal legislation passed by the Democrats. They just didn't want to do more of it. You conserve in the Disraeli way. You see? A little bit more concerned about the budget. Not much. That's what it was, okay? That's what it was. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because this would, of course, affect how a guy like him, coming from his background and his social class and his patrician class, would view the Arab-Israeli conflict. You understand? I mean, you understand that this is going to be from the group that said like this: maybe Israel wasn't a great idea in the first place, and then maybe it wasn't the right thing for America to do. I mean, it's done, and Truman did it, and they're here. Okay, I'm not advocating for Holocaust, but it wasn't necessarily the smartest idea. You see, it's that kind of a background, because that's that whole class that thought that way. But I do want to be clear that he was not an anti-Semite. I don't think so. Neither was Eisenhower. They were, after all, both veterans, what they call the greatest generation, the World War II. Bush was shot down by the Japs. In fact, he was shot down over an island, and he landed the plane right past the island in the water, and the Japs came to get him and eat him, because the other pilot who fell out was eaten. The same, because they were starving in World War II, and it was a close call, and you can make a movie out of this, because he was stuck in the water, and then from nowhere, just right next to him, an American submarine got up, like a movie, and pulled him in. Well, there it is. Watch this.
20-year-old George Bush spent 30 days on that submarine, thinking, as he later told the author James Bradley, why had I been spared? What did God have in store for me? David Martin, CBS News, The Pentagon.
Now, I want to be clear. He was 18 years old when he finished college, high school, whatever, and he could have gotten, as a lot of these upper-ups did, a safe situation, and he volunteered to go in the Navy for the airplanes. So knows he almost got killed. So I'm just trying to say, if you came in a generation, usually you're not associated with anti-Semitism. That's the point I'm going to bring out. Okay? This is a generation that fought Hitler. Okay? Now, that's not the same thing as loving Israel. So he was no anti-Semite. He certainly was a member of the WASP consensus that Truman had made a mistake in creating Israel and so forth. The USA had unwisely earned Arab enmity, which is certainly a mistake as far as the Cold War is concerned. Now, these guys like Atchison, they didn't do nothing wrong to Israel, but they held their nose because they said it was just, Truman made a mistake. And I remember, if you read all the old history books from my youth, they always say like this: well, Jewish vote, 1948, Truman, what do you expect? It happened, but it wasn't the right thing to do. This is very different, for example, than someone like Ronald Reagan or somebody who's coming out with the idea that Israel are the good guys, you see? Or Lyndon Johnson, they just viewed it differently, okay? Plus, if you're a Bush, and again, coming from his background, which you and I don't have, they're the whip-and-proof society and the skull and bones and all that world of the elite fraternities and all that junk, you just know everybody because you meet them at parties and whatever. That whole world was of the view that an injustice had been done to the Palestinians, to the refugees. People that shouldn't forget about them. Okay? This was the consensus opinion among the high and mighty. Finally, Bush was a member of what I would call the legal tradition of American foreign policy, which sought to bring world peace through the world law. Okay? Which goes back, as you see, to Woodrow Wilson. And that is the idea that the whole world should be run the way America is run, in law and order. And there should be in it. In other words, they really believe in the United Nations idea, just hasn't been perfected yet, and that the different countries should adhere to the laws that are out there. And if not, there should be punishments. That's one mahal. That is, by the way, the American tradition, for better or worse. All of our secretaries of state, just about, all the secretaries of state have been lawyers. Certainly for a long time, most of them in the 1800s and most of them in the 1900s. That's just an interesting thing I said, right? Most of your secretaries of state have been lawyers. You think, for example, of Cyrus Vance and Warren Christopher, and who was it? Dulles was a big lawyer, and Stimson. And yeah, that's their mahalik, and that's the way they thought. As opposed to Kissinger, by the way, who is not, and wrote a famous book in which he said that that's baloney. The world runs on political realpolitik. You understand? Countries have needs and this, and that, and the other. And the balance of power and things like that is what should organize American politics, because you get a better result. You understand? Better result. But Bush was no genius or anything like that. He just, like I said before, he had a decent mind. He had a good education and all the rest of it. Also, we'll see later on, like many of these rich guys, he wasn't a big reader or very self-reflective or things like that. And, the legal tradition is the way to go. Although Bush was not a lawyer. Never went to law school. Now, because of the war. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have. Forget, he was 2-3 years, whatever, at the service. Okay. Now, remember, I think many of us will remember, what did Bush say after he beat Saddam Hussein? Now we can have a new world order. Do you remember that? What does a new world order mean? It didn't mean, some dictatorship or whatever. Russia fell down. Saddam is down. Now we can make a world of law. That's how he saw, the way it should be. As a legalist, to Bush, Israel, ever since the 1967 war, had shown itself unreasonable and illegitimately expansionist. Not a single settlement or anything beyond the 67 border was permissible. Israel was on this side, the occupied territories on this side, and dos y dos. I understand if Israel said they don't want to withdraw until they get a peace treaty and all that stuff, that I understand. But you don't have any right, listen to what I'm about to tell you, you don't have any right to build a single house near the Kotel. It's not your territory. The whole Rova, you know what I mean? Anything in Yerushalayim, and certainly, within the occupied territories themselves, the Golan Heights, all the rest of it, Israel does not have a right to any of that. Now, this was the consensus among a certain chalik, and still is, of the American foreign policy elites, and that's the group that Bush emerged out of. And they were not interested in what I call the Yehuda Blum arguments. Notice Israel had, if you want to get down to it, get populistic, Israel has arguments which these two guys have made, and he still is making. I heard him in Hopkins. They're international law professors, and they can explain to you that actually the West Bank was never owned by anybody. Jordan had no right to occupy it from 48 to 67. It never didn't belong to anybody. So if Israel builds a settlement there, they're not taking anybody else's territory. And kazeh. In other words, if you want to, you can make the case. But, those words didn't mean anything to the type of WASP people that I'm talking about. Okay? Now, I want to repeat, Bush did not want a Holocaust. He didn't want Israel destroyed. Once it's here, it's here. That's not who he was. But he wanted the 1967 borders and a two-state solution, which he thought possible, and which the Israeli Labor Party agreed with. This is the problem. This was the position, more or less, with Peres and Shamir and the whole gang. That's what it is. It was supremely frustrating to Bush and company that during his presidency, it had to be Likud and Shamir who were in power. And I say, no, why did you do this to me? Why couldn't I have, it would be Gan Eden. Let's have Peres and the Labor Party, and then we'll agree, it'll take 6 months, and the whole business will be done. And then we'll have peace forever. The argument against it is the Arabs were alive. I'm just saying, there's a world the way they saw it. In addition, Bush was aware that by 1989, AIPAC and the whole Israeli lobby and the American Jewish vote and all the rest of it were stronger than ever, and that the Jewish vote was important. Now, when I say the Jewish vote is important, to a Republican, it means something different than a Democrat. A Jewish vote means winning in relative terms. So you understand, Reagan got 40% of the Jewish vote. Okay? Next time last, Bush got 35% of the Jewish vote. So that's more than Trump. Okay? It's more than a third. Now, what I'm trying to say is like this. No Republican ever figures he's going to get 51%. But you don't need to. All you need to do is cancel it. You get it? So if you get, for example, 50% of the Jewish vote and the Democrats 50%, then it's nothing. You follow? So if you get 30 or 35% or 40%, that's a big chalik. In other words, then the only Jewish vote that's against you is like 10%, 12%. That's how they think. If you're Republican, you have no choice. You get it? The Jews, at least the way it's until now, are not going to vote in large numbers for Republican. That's just how it goes. But the question is, look, 40%, the Reagan has a lot. Okay? So I'm just trying to explain to you that if you're in the Bush White House, you're aware of all this. So what I'm saying is that the Jews were an important constituency in the Reagan coalition. And as a realist, Bush had to figure with that. This is an interesting psychological aspect, in my opinion, of George Bush Sr. You see, he came after Reagan, and he disdained Reagan. Okay? On the one hand, he looked down on Reagan, who said, remember, trees cause the pollution. Remember that? And he said Reagan had voodoo economics. And he said Reagan is a Cold War extremist. He said it's all before he was vice president. Okay? Plus, look, Bush came from such a chashuva background. Ronald Reagan's father was a drug alcoholic, came from a broken family. He grew up who knows how. And Bush went to Yale and who knows what, and Reagan went to Eureka College. You get it? From class point of view, you know, how can he compare to me? And when he was an actor, I was ambassador to China and this and that and the other. You see, he doesn't have my resume, all the rest of it. The problem is, nobody else felt like that. The Republican voters didn't feel like that. Bush was painfully aware that it was Reagan and not Bush who had won the hearts and minds of the Republican masses. Deep down, Bush had to realize that he had only been elected as a third term for Ronald Reagan. That's a fact. He would never get it. Do you remember? Bush had to pretend that he likes pork rinds. Because he wanted to show, oh, he's one of the boys down there. Yeah, the guy from Cordon Bleu, from the skull and bones. Oh, I like the pork rinds. You get it? Because he's trying. So it's a pandering. The point is, he said, I guess I'm gonna hold my nose, do what I got to do to get elected. But the public doesn't see that I'm better than Reagan. You had the same thing now with what they call Trump and the other Bush, right? He just blew him away. He said, how can you, Trump is an idiot, and I'm Bush, and all the rest of it. It didn't mean nothing to the voters. So it's just interesting, right? Now, if he's a third term for Reagan, being pro-Israel is part of that legacy. So he had to be aware of that. You understand? Reagan created his own coalition with a lot of Democrats voted for him and so forth, the Catholics and the workers and all this. We remember this. And a lot of Jews. Now, the majority didn't, but a lot did. And it was all part, and Reagan was totally identified with the neocons and all that kind of stuff. And I'll say it again, Hay was very pro-Israel. Schultz was very pro-Israel. So, this is just part of what Bush is saddled with. He did try to separate himself, Bush did, from Reagan. But when he did so, it didn't work. Remember, he said like this, no new taxes. And followed by, yes, new taxes. You understand? So I'm just saying, it's interesting. Plus, for an educated person, Bush was curiously inarticulate and maladroit on the hustings and other places if he didn't have a text. I remember this very clearly. Maybe you do. The guy couldn't talk. A division thing, just vote for me. I'm the best for you. It's interesting. In other words, Reagan, who didn't have a fancy education, actually read books. It's people won't admit it or something like that. He thought of ideas. I don't say he won a graduate seminar or something like that, but more surprising than you read his letters, read his writings. It surprised people. I don't think Bush read. You understand? So there's a lot of people out there in America. They've had a very good education in high school, it could be a prep school, and the other things. They pass their tests and all the rest of it. But when they leave, as they say, they don't open a Gemara ever again. They don't a book. It's not who they were. It's interesting to go down the list of the presidents that we've had in the 20th century and which ones read books and were intellectual and thought of ideas and tried to apply them in some sense to the public arena, and which ones did not. It's interesting. Clinton, for example, did. Wasn't a fan of Clinton, but he was an intellectual guy and he was always looking for new ideas out there, and he cracked the books. Reagan did it. Nixon surprisingly did. What do you call it? Truman didn't do that. Truman read a lot of history books that you pick up in the library, which is a different thing altogether. And he knew it. He didn't deny it. Roosevelt was not a reader. It's when you go down the list. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was a big reader, and Woodrow Wilson. So it's interesting when you go. The American people do not necessarily look for big intellectuals in the ring. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten George Bush and Trump and now Biden. It wouldn't have happened. Now, Obama was a reader. Okay? Maybe he had the right books, the wrong books, but you get what I'm saying? It's the world of ideas. It's possibly a politician go all your life without having any ideas. It's just interesting to me. You get a staff and they say, I guess, give me some ideas. That is what most politicians do. A lot of the Jewish guys that I know, as we'll see in a minute, got their jobs in the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, because the guy said like this, I got elected, I got appointed, now tell me some ideas. That's what I'm paying you for. Tell me some ideas. So it's a strange, okay? Now, So it's a fascinating psychological story that we have tonight. It didn't bode well for a Likud-led Israel, especially when the first thing Bush did, right after he got elected, was to name James Baker and Brent Scowcroft to the top jobs. Right? So during his administration, his best friend, he made Secretary of State, James Baker III, and General Scowcroft, who had been the National Security Advisor, deputy to Kissinger, and then he was the National Security Advisor under Ford, was made under, under Bush. Okay? Now, let's put it this way. Neither of these guys loved Israel. It's not the background. Okay? They're both WASP, public service, background kind of stuff. Scowcroft, I totally get it. So like this, we could get along so great with the Arab world if not for Israel. The Russians wouldn't even be there. They don't even like the Russians, They're just using them. It is what it is. So we have to manage this relationship. I understand it's part of the situation. This is very different than having a pro-Israel guy in there. And Baker, as we'll see in a minute also, I'm not going to say he was anti-Semitic, even though I thought he was at the time, but I don't now. But he wasn't at all emotionally invested in Israel. It didn't mean nothing to them. There's a world of difference between James Baker on the one hand and George Shultz on the other. It's a world of difference, you see? So, and Baker would be the strongest Secretary of State that I can remember because he had the closest relationship. It's like Truman Atchison, but even more, because Baker was the best friend. So in other words, the State Department ran the show during Bush's years, and he did not undermine them. So if you're Israel, you can't do what they did based under Truman. Atchison would say, we're not doing this for Israel, and then we call up Eddie Jacobson, and go around the corner or something like that. You couldn't do that with Bush. You see? And so it's just very interesting. Baker, to me, is a very interesting example of a certain type of Secretary of State. He was, by this time, the master of Washington, D.C. He'd been for 8 years a big macher under Reagan, and before that, and he knew, who to flatter and who's powerful and which reporter to talk to and all that kind of, and what rumor to drop at which party. And so he was a master of that sort of thing. And so it'll be Baker's policy and his handling of the Middle East for the next 4 years. Bush will just back him. Now, Scowcroft was not a Kissinger. He didn't backstab him. You understand? Scowcroft's job is just, handle the flow of information to the President of the United States. And so the State Department, well, I shouldn't say that, as you'll see in a second. It's not Pashut. It was Baker himself that ran the Middle Eastern policy because he focused on it, which is interesting. It was not the State Department per se. Now, is this bad for Israel? Okay, the stage is now set, and here we go. The Bush administration comes in the office, of course, in January of 1989, planning to achieve a two-state solution in some form or another. It could be part of Jordan. It could be its own thing. It could be with Arafat. It could be no, that, I don't care. We just want to make it that the Arab-Israeli conflict is now settled. You understand? And the heart of it is the Palestinian issue, and therefore we're going to make everybody happy, or at least equally unhappy, and Gamarno, and then we'll go on and we'll make it work. Okay? Now, Bush and his administration know they cannot threaten Israel or cut off aid. That would have worked in a second. They said, I just want you to know, Israel is so dependent. They need to tell you, Israel, especially in those years, before they had a good economy, was so dependent on American money. It's ridiculous, So if they would say, you do this or else we'll cut off the money, or we'll delay paying you the money this year, they had no choice, you see? They didn't do that. In Baker, James Baker III, Shamir and the Likud had a formidable adversary who was a champion leaker and a molder of public opinion, like I told you before. He knew how do you get the story in the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post and all these others? You leak to the right person. And so at that time, this is before the internet, people actually read newspapers, and that made a tremendous hashpah. It governed the discourse, as we say over here, right? You saw that elitism over it. It's before tweets, Now, President of the United States is a tweet. It's inconceivable back in the time I'm talking about. It's only a few years ago. Look how the world has changed. Okay? Now, basically, the Bush administration, like its predecessors, viewed the two-state solution as a good deal for Israel. After all, you get peace. We're now going to make it that Israel finally has the final victory of the 1948 war. Hear what I just said? The Maccabee passage of 1948, 1949. The borders you achieved in that year will now be secure forever. Because the Arabs and everybody will sign a peace treaty and they recognize this, the border of Israel. Doesn't get better than that. In addition, the Bush administration assumed, and so did the Israeli Labor Party, that as part of the deal, the Palestinians would renounce the right of return, which again is huge. That's the make or break. Because if they say they're not going to have all the people from that time go back and move back to Israel, you won't have an Arab majority. Israel will be able to survive as a Jewish state. If they say we want everybody to come back to Israel, too many Arabs, they'll outvote the Israelis, and then Israel will be out of business. So the right of return is like the core of the whole thing. If you strip it down literally to its bare essentials. If you put away this issue, you put away that issue, cut away all the rest, and you go to the core of it, listen, it's the right of return. Now, I want to say, and looking back now, it's 30 years later, such a renunciation was never actually offered by Arafat, ever. But he played a footsie with it, and he's hinting and suggesting all the time, and yeah, I'll do it, and yeah, this, that, and the other. But he had no intention of doing that. He had no intention of doing that. Arafat's plan, which he succeeded in eventually, was exactly to get an Oslo agreement without renouncing the right of return. So I want to be clear. Today, as we're in the year 2021, and now it's the Biden administration and whatever, and they're trying behind the scenes to do all this stuff, and I understand why, and bring some kind of a peace treaty, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, leave Gaza out of it for the moment. Abu Abbas, whatever his name is, they've never agreed to renounce the right of return. I'm told today. Okay? They always say like this. This is how they do it. No, let's keep it in. Nobody will want to move in anyway. Don't worry about it. You know what I said? In other words, you can buy my house. I know you're not going to actually go and move in. You see? So the core of the problem was never going to be solved by Bush. But he didn't see it that way in the years I'm talking about. And Baker didn't see it that way. And frankly, the U.S. today, is more sensitized to this issue because they've gone through several, iterations of this in the last 30 years. But, they all see it as a doable sort of proposition, mainly because what's the alternative? If you don't keep pushing for it, you tell me to be no peace. If there's no peace, then, it's unthinkable. We can't go on like this forever. That's the mentality. So what do you do with a hard problem you can't solve? This is what you're dealing with in the current climate. Okay? Now, as I said before, Baker, like Bush, had elite education. These guys always went to the Ivy League stuff. But they were not intellectually curious, as I said before. They didn't read. Yeah, here it is. These are the presidents I thought of that read. It's interesting, right? So think of the names that I'm not putting in there. The others didn't really read. Didn't think, like I said, they hired people to give me ideas. You see? Baker did not study the history of the Jews. That's not who he was. He never studied the history of Arab-Israeli conflict. That's not who he was. He read the New York Times every day. That's who he was. You see what I'm saying? He was not emotionally engaged. He looked at the whole Arab-Israeli conflict like a lawyer. He was a very competent lawyer. He was a chashuv guy. But a detached lawyer whose client was the United States of America and not the principals. Okay? Which totally makes sense. This could not necessarily work so well in the Middle East because you got to know all the nitty-gritty stuff. On the other hand, Baker was a ball of fire. He had energy and focus and, and he was smart, very smart. And, if he wrestled on an idea, he could go after it. But now you are in the end of 1988, and you just got appointed Secretary of State, and one of the items on your agenda the next 4 years is going to be Arab-Israeli conflict. So how does that actually happen? What do you do when you're going to be next to Secretary of State? How does it actually work? Well, interestingly, he didn't do what they usually do, is call the Foreign Service officers. Let's go to the State Department and talk to the people in the Middle East division and tell me, what do you see, and this, and that, and the other. They didn't do that. Instead, he went kind of outside the State Department and ran foreign policy on the Arab-Israeli conflict for the next 4 years, pretty much outside the regular area, the circle of the State Department, by going with Dennis Ross. Okay? Now, Dennis Ross, a Jewish guy, who was a Middle East expert, let's put it that way. Meaning he went to college and he specialized in Arabic and that sort of thing. Also Soviet Union business. So he's what we would call a defense intellectual from that area. This is in the 70s. Believe it or not, he used to work for McGovern, but he switched and became more conservative, as many did, for the Reagan election. He was a Reaganite. I would say he was a moderate neocon disciple of Paul Wolfowitz. These are all the guys that came up with the neocons. In university in California, he specialized in studying the Soviet Union and the Middle East. And when George Shultz, in Reagan's time, became Secretary of State, he made Dennis Ross the head of the policy planning division of the State Department, which is a very chashuv position. That's the George Kennan post, the policy planning post of the State Department, even though the guy's not a member of the State Department. And he wasn't a member of the Foreign Service. So in other words, he brought in as an egghead. You understand? So that means that he occupied a very influential role in the second Reagan administration. I just want to be clear about that. Vis-a-vis the Russians, vis-a-vis the Chinese, and vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict. Okay? Now, that's just interesting. And you know what they say in Israel, if you know the right people, you don't need protexia. You know, this is a classic case of a guy who made the right moves, quote-unquote, career-wise. You see what I'm saying? Never finished his PhD, didn't need to. Didn't need to. You know, got his appointed a big macher in the State Department right away. So, he knows how to, I mean, I don't blame him. You know, he knows how to work in that world. Now, that means that by the time Bush is elected, Dennis Ross was part of Shultz's Middle East team, and he was familiar with all the aspects and details of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the U.S. relationship to it, because he was together with Shultz doing all the details in 1985, 86, 87, 88. So Ross, being a clever insider, I'm just describing a person as a clever insider, was ready when Bush got elected right away with a well-thought-out and well-written position paper for the new administration, and he made sure Baker got it. And Baker said, "Oh, this makes sense. I like the way it's written." And Baker adopted him as his Middle East guy. And so for the next 4 years, there's Baker, and there's his notator. That's Dennis Ross. You don't notice these guys. They're sitting next to the guy. They're the faceless people. The faceless people in Washington are the ones with the real power. You get it? The bureaucrats, the paper pushers, the advisors, the guys with the ideas and all the other things are really, you don't look at the principles. You're wasting your time looking at him because he's just going to deliver a speech. But who wrote the speech? And who came up with the ideas? And so on and so forth. So it's interesting, as we'll see in a minute, almost all of Baker's team are Jewish on the Arab-Israeli conflict. But they're Jews who believe in the two-state solution. Well, you're clear about that. I repeat, that's what Shimon Peres believed in, that's what Yitzhak Rabin believed in, that's what Abba Eban believed in. You understand? This is a large side of the Israeli consensus. So it's very interesting. Next 4 years, Baker would be guided by what's largely a Jewish team. I mean, there's this guy, which is Dennis Ross. This guy, Aaron Miller. I hate to tell you, Aaron David Miller is Jewish. And then there's this guy, Daniel Kurtzer, who was at Shomer Shabbos. Okay? Now, depending on your position in Israeli politics, these were the good guys, these are the bad guys. If you're pro-labor, these were the good guys. If you're pro-Likud, these were the bad guys. Because they eventually brought in the Oslo and everything else. But I'll tell you again, Baker can say like this, look, I got a minion here. They're the ones giving me these ideas. You don't have to go after me, okay? I got 3 Jews who believe in the two-state solution, so don't accuse me of anti-Semitism. Because I don't have Palestinians on my team. I don't have Arabs on my team. This is a Baker way, get it? You insulate yourself against accusations of anti-Semitism. And I don't mean that, I do mean it cynically. B, I don't mean only cynically. Only cynically. Now, like Bush, I said before, Baker wasn't really anti-Semitic, although I thought he was, in my opinion, but he considered Israel to be a pain in the neck. On the other hand, a born problem solver, because that's who he was, he knew if I can solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, I'll go down to history with the Nobel Prize and all the other stuff. So you had that, which, by the way, that's a worthy ambition. There's nothing wrong with having that ambition, okay? Now, Baker and his Jews really believed in a two-state solution. They're true believers. This was the goal to pursue. And I repeat, Yitzhak Rabin, who'd been the general, and Peres and all these other guys all agreed with this, okay? The problem, of course, was the Likud government, and they were in power, saw things quite differently. Yitzhak Shamir didn't know exactly how, but he wanted to annex the West Bank. He wanted Eretz Yisrael Hashlema. That's who he is, right? How can we give back Judea? How can you, Samaria? It's our land. And once you give it back, you never get it again. How can you do that? Now, I get it, and you here in Shomer Emunah get it. Now go explain this to the public. Go explain. You hear what I'm saying? Go sell this to the Hamonam. In other words, the Likud prized land over peace for two reasons. First of all, it's what I call the Jabotinsky reasons. It's our land, right? It's our Jordan too. All right, we're Mavatar and Jordan. But this part is ours. How can a Jew give up Shechem? How can a Jew give up Hebron? How can a Jew give up the Kotel, the Har Bayis? Like that kind of talk. Second of all, security. Totally separate from the sentiment. How can you allow a Palestinian state in the, the borders, what they look like? If you, let's go back one. We all know, look how narrow Israel is. If you'll turn this, I'll use modern language. If you'll turn all this into a Gaza, it's impossible for Israel. Because Israel today is facing, as you and I know very well, an impossible situation in Gaza. It's an impossible situation with Hamas. So, if we pull out of the West Bank, totally aside from everything else, it'll be impossible for Israel to survive. That is the Likud position. But not Bush and Baker. Number one, as far as Jabotinsky is concerned, we are opposed in principle to a greater Israel. Israel is the 1948 borders and Gunug. You understand? And the Arabs get their state also. After all, Baker would say, Bush would say, are you telling me the Palestinians are to get zero? How do you expect that to work? You have a problem, don't you? You have a couple million people, and it's more and more all the time. What exactly is your plan? You think they'll just sit there forever? You have to tell me a plan. That's how Baker talks. Okay? And number two, what about security? As I said before, security threat. So Bush said, I guess, that's a tiny, no question about it. But arrangements can be figured out. We'll talk to the generals, In other words, the U.S. will honestly and sincerely do whatever Israel wants, and give you whatever you need for the security. They would. You tell me you need 10,000 tanks? If it's part of a two-state solution, they're really pulling out America, we'll give them 10,000 tanks or whatever they need. They get it? We'll make it work. Let's talk about it. Shamir was very wary because at the end of the day, nothing really works in terms of security, as we see with Gaza today. Understand? Now, I want to point out, it's been almost 30 years since the Oslo. It's been about 20 years since the Gaza, since Hamas took over Gaza. It's very likely that Hamas will take over the West Bank tomorrow. You know, nobody's talking about it. That guy is in his 80s. Israel's praying he should live to be 120. You know what happens then? And the people, I bet you the rove of the people in the West Bank want to Hamas. So then what happens then? You see my point? What happens then? This is a can that's been kicked down the road, but only so far. What is the point? Nobody. I don't know any good. Tell me a good answer. There's no good answer. So here we are 30 years ago. Okay? Now, the style of Baker is very interesting, and Bush. It's a very, what do you call co-opting. When he became president, he said to Shamir like this, tell me, what's your plan? We'll go with it. Tell me your plan for solving the Palestinian issue. Okay? What does Israel propose to solve the Palestinian problem? What's the solution? You tell us what you want, and we'll go with it. You see how it works? I co-opted you, right? Tell me what you need to make this happen, and we'll do it. And what Shamir is supposed to say is, I have no plan whatsoever, which he had. They couldn't do it, right? So all Shamir could do was fumfa, stall and delay and this, that, and the other, hoping that Bush and Baker would lose interest and move on. Because that worked before in other administrations. There's a big world out there, and different crises kick in. And after a while, what was front and center in the Arab-Israeli conflict gets moved to the back because another problem happened and another problem happened. But he made the mistake. Bush and Baker stayed focused. That's just who they were. The Bush administration dealt with a lot of problems in the world, but they stayed focused in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and they don't go away. And they're inspired by a commitment to the notion that the Palestinians are entitled, or just as entitled to a state or something like a state, as are the Israelis. Not at the expense of the Israelis, but on the other hand, the Israelis' rights are not justified at the expense of the Palestinians. So it's a classic American position. That's all. Classic American position. Now, this was different than the other administrations that we had before. Certainly different than Reagan. Okay? That's why when you judge a president, I'm not interested in, little cliches and this, that, and the other. You look at the record. Okay? Now, Bush and Baker never did anything to Israel. I want to be clear about this. And they never threatened them either. That wasn't their style. But rather, Baker, I would say, was very Jewish in his tactics. First of all, he kvetched. And very good, it's an art form, a kvetcher, right? Particularly about miscommunications. Right, I'm going to show you something in a second. A little extended. Tell me if you agree with me. I look at the body language. When Bush became president, by April, Shamir came, it happens, first time to the White House, and they had their meeting, and they have what you call White House dinner. Get it? White House dinner, formal business. And president makes a toast, the other guy makes a toast. So, at least to me, Bush seems very ill at ease, and he's going to say all the right things about Israel, but it's like, And Shamir definitely so. And so you see a classic example of diplomacy in which you say one thing, but you really mean something different. Tell me if you agree or disagree with what I said.
I recall the trips that I made to your country. First, I think Barbara and I in 1979, and then in the summer of 1986. And I recall the deep longing for peace that I found on the part of the people there in Israel. And I'm grateful for your visit now, in the first days of our brand new administration. And also, because you see Washington in springtime, which some say is its most beautiful season, and because you had a chance to go to the Air and Space Museum today, where we saw many American tourists. And for those of you who weren't with us, it was a wonderful thing, because you heard people saying to the crowd, "Shalom, I thought they were all tourists from Texas," but no, they knew that much. And I think they expressed the affection that we all feel for Israel and for you, sir. But the friendship, the alliance between the United States and Israel is strong and solid, built upon a foundation of shared democratic values, of shared history and heritage that sustain the moral life of our two countries. The emotional bond of our peoples it transcends politics. Our strategic cooperation, and I renew today our determination that go forward, is a source of mutual security, and the United States' commitment to the security of Israel remains unshakable. We may differ over some policies from time to time, individual policies, but never over this principle. Mr. Prime Minister, the great unsolved challenge that concerns us both is peace in the Middle East. And we know peace is possible. Last month, we marked the 10th anniversary of the treaty between Israel and Egypt. And that treaty was the product of the remarkable courage and leadership of two men. And also, I want to say right here in this White House, and also we'll give credit to the strong, principled, mediating efforts of President Carter, too. Those qualities, courage and leadership, are no less necessary today in the effort to advance the cause of peace in the Middle East. We also know there's much more to do. Mr. Prime Minister, the discussions that we have had, and then those I had earlier this week with President Mubarak, give me reason to hope that in the Middle East today there is leadership, courage, and vision capable of transcending the historic animosities that have long stood as obstacles on the path towards peace. The United States is proud of the role it has played in the search for peace. We know a partnership with Israel in peace can work, and we stand ready today to take another step for the cause of peace in the Middle East. Mr. Prime Minister and Mrs. Shamir, I raise my glass to the abiding friendship between our two nations and lasting peace among the peoples of the Middle East, and to life. L'chaim.
Mr. President, Mrs. Bush, distinguished secretaries, members of the Senate, the House of Representatives, judges, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It is almost exactly a year ago since you, Mr. President, graciously entertained my wife and me and my colleagues at dinner in your previous capacity as Vice President. At that time, they were both facing elections. You were already very much on the campaign trail, and I was preparing to set out on mine. It was a demanding but interesting experience, and here we both are. It is therefore only natural that we never stop searching for the road to peace. The yearning for peace is ingrained in the national tradition and character of our people. We pray for peace 3 times every day. We despise violence and war. We refuse to believe that a military confrontation is a valid way to solving disputes, but we cannot permit our abhorrence of war to be used against us by terrorists and dictators to force us to submit to their demands. We want to devote and utilize the talents and skills of our people for creativity, for scholarship, for science, for medicine, not for developing more and more sophisticated instruments of war. But until today, we have had no choice. Therefore, in the absence of peace, we must be strong as you are.
Sounds like some of my teachers in high school. They, by the way, you don't usually get to see a White House dinner, do you? Okay. Do you see my point? I mean, he was reading the text. He didn't feel comfortable with all that. You do what you got to do. And Shamir also, I cut some of his stuff out there because basically we're saying like this: yeah, peace is a great idea, but but when you get down, to the nitty gritty, I don't want to get killed. Now, it is what it is. Different interpretations of language immediately emerged. Take a look at this. Bush and Baker had a strained relationship with the Israeli leaders from the start. In other words, from the meeting that you and I just saw. Prime Minister Shamir came to visit in April '89, shortly after a new administration took office. Whatever was said ended up driving an enduring wedge between the two sides. During the meeting, Shamir told Bush settlements in the occupied territory shouldn't be a problem. Well, what does that mean? Understand? Shouldn't be a problem for the new administration's peace talks. Bush and Baker saw it as a commitment not to expand the settlements. Whereas the Israeli prime minister meant the opposite, that it would continue to build in the occupied territories because such shouldn't be a problem. So you see the problem with, now just trying to tell you, that's diplomacy, it's a miscommunication. 2 weeks later, more settlements were announced. Bush believed Shamir had lied to him and never forgave him. So much for the White House dinner. Understand? That's what I tell you. You always have to look what's going on behind all the smiles. Now, what can I tell you? For a practiced leaker like Baker, kvetching was an art form. And how do they know this? He told reporters that they lied to us. They promised this, they said that, and all the rest of it. Next thing you see in the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and the LA Times, on CBS News, and NBC, you know how it goes, okay? The trouble is that, the Israeli Labor Party did not back Shamir. That's the opposite. So Abba Eban, as you see over here, said, no, the problem with the Bush administration is they're not squeezing Israel harder. So cut off the money to them, and that'll force them to go for a two-state solution. That's what Eban said. Okay, Abba Eban. Okay. And finally, I would say over here, Baker was very good at that other Jewish thing. I would say the passive-aggressive. Okay? And very, very Jewish business, you know. Do what you want. I'm not complaining, you know, like half the people I meet in Schultz. You know, well, take a look at this.
For many Israelis, it will not be easy to enter a negotiating process whose successful outcome will in all probability involve territorial withdrawal and the emergence of a new political reality. For Palestinians, such an outcome will mean an end to the illusion of control over all of Palestine, and it will mean full recognition of Israel as a neighbor and partner in trade and in human contact.
This is speech of Yitzhak.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do not think there is a real constructive alternative to the process which I have outlined. Continuation of the status quo will lead to increasing violence and worsening prospects for peace. We think now is the time to move toward a serious negotiating process to create the atmosphere for a renewed peace process. Let the Arab world take concrete steps towards accommodation with Israel, not in place of the peace process, but as a catalyst for it. And so we would say, end the economic boycott, stop the challenges to Israel's standing in international organizations, repudiate the odious line that Zionism is racism. For Israel, now is the time to lay aside once and for all the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel. Israeli interests in the West Bank and Gaza, security and otherwise, can be accommodated in a settlement based on Resolution 242. Forswear annexation. Stop settlement activity. Allow schools to reopen. Reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights. For Palestinians, now is the time to speak with one voice for peace. Renounce the policy of phases in all languages, not just those addressed to the West. Practice constructive diplomacy, not attempts to distort international organizations such as the World Health Organization. Amend the covenant. Translate the dialogue of violence in the Intifada into a dialogue of politics and diplomacy. Violence will not work. Reach out to Israelis and convince them of your peaceful intentions. You have the most to gain from doing so, and no one else can or will do it for you. Finally, understand that no one is going to deliver Israel for you.
Now, this is a famous, is that pro or anti-Israel? So he said, give up Greater Israel, stop the settlements, all the rest of it. This I made a mistake in my notes. This is not the passive-aggressive part. This is the AIPAC part. This was seen, I remember at that time down till today, said Baker's anti-Israel. Who wrote that speech? I told you before. These guys have the thing. The guy wrote for the speech, attacking the whole idea of Eretz Yisrael Hashlema. A Shomer Shabbos member of his staff, right? A YU grad, a dean of YU, right? Daniel Kurtzer, he wrote the speech. Now, wait a minute, it gets better than that. There was an original draft of the speech written by another Shomer Shabbos member of Baker's staff, Harvey Sickerman, who wrote a sefer. He went to the shul, what's it called, Lower Merion Shul in Philly, and Lolly's father. So, and he was a Hague supporter. So he wrote a whole speech for him, leaving all that out. Just a nice AIPAC speech, all the rest of it. No, but Daniel Kurtz said, no, you have to put in the thing attacking Greater Israel and prohibiting the settlements. So Baker could say like this, what do you want for my life? My whole staff is from, don't get angry at me. But it didn't turn out that way, did it? People say, yes, you're the one who attacked Israel. You said no settlement. You said it's a Greater Israel. And by doing that, you kind of closed off the options for Israel to retain anything from the West Bank, no matter what they needed. So you see, words, that's why it's a fascinating story to me. Words have a life of their own, and once you say them, you don't control them anymore. That's a famous word from the Chavetz Chaim, correct? You say something, and you don't know the words anymore. So Baker can say, well, you don't know the context. A nut like me went into the background of all this sort of thing. The whole world doesn't know what I just said. You see? And again, this Shomer Shabbos guy said this YU guy said that, all the rest of it. Baker just said, give me the draft, and whatever sounds the best, I'll use. Okay? Now, so Baker and Bush chose to make settlements a big deal. For his part, Shamir might have slowed down the settlements for the next 4 years, but he was pushed in Israel. Remember I told you last week after the Targil Hamasriach, so he had a small coalition just with the religious parties and with the right-wing parties. So the Gush Amanim say you can't stop building settlements from a religious perspective. Okay? It's Eretz Yisrael. It belongs to us. Jews have a right to settle in Hebron and places like that. And Shamir, of course, was sympathetic to this. That's who he was. Yitzhak Shamir was not a Shomer Shabbos Jew. Not at all. But I want to remind you what I told you last year. In Israel, Saturday's the day off. And he used to spend Saturdays relaxing in his sofa, in his apartment in Tel Aviv, listening to Chazanas, cantorial records. Old school, So I'm trying to say it like this. This is the Likud of yesteryear, They were Jewish and the Kishkas, right? And so he can understand that. And also the right-wing parties who were part of his coalition, without which he didn't have 61. Let's go to the next one. There's Yuval Ne'eman, there's General Eitan, there's General Ze'evi, Racham Ze'evi. These guys each had a party of 2 or 3. And altogether it's like 6 or 7 or 8. And that's an important part of a coalition of 65 altogether. Okay? And they definitely say, you can't listen to Baker. I mean, are you crazy? If you stop this and settlements, what, are we going to pull every Jew out of East Jerusalem? Really? You're going to go back to the Mandelbaum Gate? Is that the plan? And second of all, what I mean to say is like this. It's impossible to maintain military security that way. In the same way, Israel doesn't really have a way to maintain military security with the Gaza Strip. There's no way for them to solve the Gaza problem. They just don't have a way. You see? So you want to multiply that from the old Shtachim? So if you're Shamir, you're getting it from this way, you're getting it from this way. All right? Now, so the end is Israel kept on building new settlements throughout this period. In fact, the guy in charge of the government was Ariel Sharon. And at that time, he happened to be in a provocative mood. And I remember very clearly, Baker once came to Israel to ask no settlements. And Sharon says, today we're launching 5 new settlements. No, stick it in your face. Which is stupid. Understand? You don't do that as Secretary of State of the United States. And besides everything else, even if you disagree with me, it's stupid, you're stabbing AIPAC in the back. What are they supposed to do in America? You understand? What are they supposed to do in America? As a result, relations between the Likud government and the Bush administration plummeted to a low. The last time this happened was under Carter. But Carter himself was a turnoff. So the damage, bad as it was limited. You understand? When Carter, if you remember, attacked Israel, the rest of it, he was having trouble with the Iran hostage crisis, and the gasoline went crazy, and the Malays, and I don't remember 10 other things that were going on at that time. Do you remember, as a stagflation, the guns of business was all going crazy. So people, actually, it was probably good to be criticized by Carter, because everybody's saying such a loser. If you criticize, it must be good. The Bush and Bick were not in that situation. They were coming when the Cold War was being won by America. America was riding high. It was a different thing altogether. You understand? they were on a roll thanks to the unraveling of the USSR. And I told you, Baker was just a lot better as a politician, a million times better as a politician than Carter was. This is the passive-aggressive part. Listen to this.
If that's going to be the approach, and that's going to be the attitude, there won't be any dialogue, and there won't be any peace, and the United States of America can't make it happen. You can't, I can't, the president can't. And so it's going to take some really good faith, affirmative
Congress
effort on the part of our good friends in Israel. And if we don't get it, and if we can't get it quickly, I have to tell you, Mr. Levine, that everybody over there should know that the telephone number is 1-202-456-1414. When you're serious about peace, call us.
What do you call that? It's like the mother-in-law, you know? You know what I'm saying? It's like the guy in shul didn't get shlishi. I got no problems, you know? But if you ever want something with me, Now, you're very Jewish. Now, anyway, by 1990, after Shamir had reassembled a coalition following what we talked about last week, the Targil HaMasriach, so it was just the Likud with the right-wing parties, let's put it that way. The Israeli regime in 1990 found itself politically isolated and internationally condemned. Worst of all, it was condemned all across the board in the USA. This is bad for Israel. You cannot have this, okay? Now, throughout all this, Shamir showed himself very tough. You know, he, as you see, was not an articulate guy, and he sounded like a shamus in the show I knew once upon a time. But nevertheless, what he called, you know, he was a man of, he wasn't a pagan with that personality and the eloquence and the way he said, it's not who he was, okay? But to give credit where credit is due, but he stuck to his guns. And even if you tell me the whole world is condemning you, he said, I guess I'm not going to give in because Israel cannot, we can't afford this threat to our security. You understand? It's better to be disliked than to agree in the setting up of a Palestinian Stalingrad. And that's what he said, you know? And it must be stated that Bush and Baker did not get in bed with the Palestinians. This whole time was a dialogue back and forth, hot and cold with Israel. In the years 1988 to 1992, is this very interesting, they did not negotiate with Arafat and these type of guys. They talked about, and I'll do that next week or 2 weeks from now, hopefully, you know, which Palestinians should be part of a Jordanian delegation, all that kind of business. But he didn't go and say like this, well, you're not talking to me, I'll talk to you. So it's interesting that way. The administration strategy, obviously, was to get Israel to change voluntarily. The Bush administration really bent over to say it's not anti-Israel. They vetoed all those resolutions against Israel in the United Nations. They helped with the Soviet Jewry. They helped with the Ethiopian Jewry. You know, that was Bush's way of saying like this is not an anti-Semitic business. But it is what it is. It's a political thing in the Middle East. They were just against the Likud, and they're in favor of a two-state solution. But no matter how savvy at PR, American Jewry was put off by Baker's body language and secretly considered him anti-Semitic. I remember this very well. Okay, I'm sure many people still do. So, you know, not many people do what I'm doing tonight, which is look everything under a microscope. The general trend is anti-Semite. Now, the Labor Party in Israel did not look at it that way, but American Jews did, and that's, I think, very interesting. Very interesting. Because, again, you say words, and then I don't want to hear anymore what I meant, or the context, or this and the others. You say words, the words have a power of their own. You understand? And I can judge you by what you say, even if you say, I didn't mean it that way and all the rest of it. Maybe I'll believe that, maybe I won't. But chances are, if you're Jewish and somebody says something that sounds un-Jewish, no. That's who we are. Now, it's just interesting. Now, Baker the whole time said, like this, my whole staff is Jewish, all the strategizers are Jewish, some of these guys are Shomer Shabbos. What do you want from my life? I didn't come up with this stuff. You see? But anyway, none of this took place in a vacuum. Politics is not like that. The Cold War was ending, which, by the way, freaked out all the Arab dictatorships because they're going to lose all their weapons and their sources of supply. Okay? Right as everything I'm talking about tonight was happening, it wasn't the only game in town. Saddam Hussein was becoming a much bigger threat, bigger than the Palestinian thing, as we know, under George Bush I. He's going to turn into the whole war. The new nations, as I tried to point out the other day, that are forming in Europe are now democratic and all pro-Israel. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all the rest of it. The map is changing. The international cholent is transforming, you see? And this was the hope of Shamir. He figured it's a new day. It's falling upon the world. A radically changed, previously unimaginable international situation may help Israel. Maybe we can hold on to the whole thing. Maybe. Okay? That is not where Bush and Baker were. They wanted a two-state solution. They wanted one now in the years 1988 to 1992. Before I conclude tonight, let me make the following observation. Shamir and Bush and Baker didn't like each other, and they didn't hide it. And as I said before, that was just at the beginning. Can you imagine if Shamir visited the White House, as he did other times in the Bush administration? The language and the body didn't say the same thing. What was the result? They shot each other. In 1992, both leaders went down to defeat. Shamir lost the election in Israel. Bush lost the election in America. It wasn't good for either of them to have that kind of perception. So it ended up being what they call Polish firing squad. You understand? And so they all took each other down. Now, you know what? Let's save that for next time. We'll do part 2. Good night. And remember, there's no lecture next week. It's in Mir Hashem 2 weeks.